Marie Fields worked hard all her life to build a secret fortune of $500,000. She wanted to leave it to her grandchildren, but her daughter, Claire, had other plans. What would drive a daughter to kill her own mother for money? This is the story of how greed turned a family against each other, leading to a shocking murder that rocked a small Illinois town. Marie Fields lived in a modest home on Elm Street in Oakville, Illinois. From the outside, it looked like any other house on the block. But inside, Marie had a secret that would change everything. Every morning, Marie woke up at 5 a.m. She put on her uniform and drove to the factory where she worked. For 30 years, she never missed a day. Her coworkers thought she was just another hardworking woman trying to make ends meet. They had no idea that Marie was quietly building a fortune. At work, Marie always volunteered for extra shifts. She packed her own lunches and never bought coffee from the vending machine. Every penny she saved went into her bank account. Year after year, her savings grew. Marie remembered the hard times she faced when she was young. She grew up poor and often went to bed hungry. Those memories stayed with her, even as an adult. She promised herself that her family would never struggle like that. This promise kept her going, even when she felt tired or lonely. As her wealth grew, Marie faced a difficult choice. She wanted to tell her daughter Claire about the money. But every time she thought about it, she hesitated. Marie worried that if Claire knew about the money, she might stop working hard. She wanted Claire to learn the value of hard work, just like she had. So Marie kept her secret. She lived in the same small house and drove the same old car. Her neighbors never suspected that she had become a wealthy woman. At night, Marie would sometimes sit alone in her living room, looking at her bank statements. She felt proud of what she had accomplished, but she also felt sad that she couldn't share it with anyone. Years passed, and Marie's fortune grew to $500,000. It was more money than she ever dreamed of having. As she got older, she started thinking about what to do with it. She thought about her grandchildren and how she could help them have a better life. Maybe she could pay for their college education or help them buy their first homes. These dreams made Marie happy. She imagined her grandchildren's faces when they learned about her gift. It would be her way of showing them how much she loved them. She started making plans to tell them when the time was right. But keeping such a big secret wasn't easy. Sometimes, when Claire visited with her husband Ethan, Marie almost told them. She wanted to share her joy and see them smile. But then she would remember her reasons for keeping it quiet, and she would stay silent. Marie didn't know it, but her secret was about to cause problems she never expected. Her plans for her hard-earned money would soon lead to a series of events that would shock everyone who knew her. Claire Peterson always struggled with money. Ever since she was young, she had trouble saving and often found herself in financial trouble. Unlike her mother, Marie, who was careful with every penny, Claire seemed to spend faster than she could earn. This pattern continued into her adult life, causing a deep rift between mother and daughter. Whenever Claire ran into money problems, she would turn to Marie for help. She would show up at her mother's modest house on Elm Street, hoping for a loan or a place to stay. Marie would offer her daughter a spare room, but she always refused to give Claire money directly. This frustrated Claire, who couldn't understand why her mother wouldn't help her more. "Mom, I'm your daughter. Why won't you help me?" Claire would ask, her voice filled with hurt and anger. But Marie stood firm, believing that giving Claire money would only make things worse in the long run. As time went on, Claire's financial struggles only grew worse. She met and married Ethan, a man who shared her dreams of a better life but also her problems with money. Together, they faced mounting debts and constant worry about how to pay their bills. They often talked about how unfair it was that Marie had money but wouldn't share it with them. "Your mom must have savings," Ethan would say to Claire. "Why doesn't she want to help us get on our feet?" These conversations fueled Claire's growing resentment towards her mother. Claire started to believe that Marie was being selfish. She convinced herself that as Marie's only child, she deserved some of her mother's wealth. The thought of her mother having money while she struggled became an obsession for Claire. She imagined all the ways her life could improve if only Marie would share her fortune. What Claire didn't know was that Marie had been saving for years to leave money to her grandchildren. Marie wanted to give them opportunities she never had, like going to college without worrying about student loans. But because Marie kept her savings a secret, Claire could only see her mother's refusal to help as a personal rejection. Marie Fields had always been cautious with her money, but her latest decision would change everything. One sunny morning, she walked into her lawyer's office with a clear purpose. She wanted to update her will. Marie had thought long and hard about what to do with her $500,000 fortune. In the end, she decided to leave it all to her grandchildren. As Marie sat across from her lawyer, she explained her reasons. She wanted her grandchildren to have opportunities she never had. College education, a good start in life, maybe even help buying their first homes. The lawyer nodded, understanding Marie's wishes. He typed up the new will, and Marie signed it with a steady hand. Marie left the lawyer's office feeling satisfied. She had done what she thought was right. But she didn't know that her decision would soon cause a storm in her family. Somehow, Claire found out about the changes to the will. The news hit her like a punch to the stomach. One evening, Claire burst into Marie's house. Her face was red with anger. "Mom, how could you?" she shouted. "Why are you leaving everything to the grandkids? What about me and Ethan?" Marie tried to stay calm. She explained her reasons, just as she had to her lawyer. But Claire wouldn't listen. She paced back and forth, her voice getting louder with each word. Ethan stood by her side, nodding in agreement with everything Claire said. "We're your family too," Claire cried. "We need that money now. The grandkids can wait." Marie felt her heart racing, but she stood her ground. "I'm sorry, Claire," she said firmly. "But this is my decision. The money is for the grandchildren's future." The argument went on for what felt like hours. Claire and Ethan threw accusations at Marie. They called her selfish, uncaring. They said she had never really loved them. Each word cut Marie deeply, but she didn't change her mind. Finally, Claire and Ethan stormed out of the house. The door slammed behind them, leaving Marie alone in the sudden silence. She sat down heavily in her favorite chair, feeling drained. She wondered if she had made the right choice. What Marie didn't know was that her decision had lit a dangerous fuse. As Claire and Ethan drove home that night, their minds were racing. They felt betrayed, angry, and desperate. As Claire and Ethan's financial situation worsened, they began to see Marie's money as the answer to all their problems. They daydreamed about what they could do with that money: pay off their debts, buy a new house, maybe even start a business. These dreams made their current struggles feel even more unfair. "We deserve that money more than anyone," Claire would say to Ethan. "We're the ones who need it now, not some future grandchildren." Ethan agreed, and together they fed each other's sense of entitlement. The more Claire and Ethan talked about Marie's money, the more they convinced themselves that they had a right to it. They started to feel like Marie was holding them back from the life they deserved. This belief grew stronger with each passing day, clouding their judgment and pushing them towards a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. Claire and Ethan's world was falling apart. Bills piled up on their kitchen table, each one a reminder of their growing debt. Ethan stared at the phone, dreading the next call from a debt collector. He had lost money on bad investments, and now they were drowning in financial trouble. Every day, Claire would look at their bank account and feel her stomach tighten. They barely had enough to buy food, let alone pay their rent. The stress was eating away at them, making them snap at each other over small things. They felt trapped, with no way out of their money problems. At night, when they lay in bed, they couldn't sleep. Their minds kept going back to Marie's money. It seemed so unfair that she had $500,000 just sitting there while they struggled to keep the lights on. They talked about it more and more, their voices getting louder as their frustration grew. One night, after another day of dodging calls from creditors, Ethan turned to Claire. "We need to do something," he said, his voice low and desperate. Claire nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. They started talking about ways to get Marie to change her mind about the will. At first, their ideas were just angry words thrown into the darkness of their bedroom. But as the nights went on, their plans became more serious. They talked about visiting Marie late at night to scare her. Maybe if they showed her how desperate they were, she would give them the money. Claire suggested they could threaten to tell everyone about Marie's secret fortune if she didn't help them. Ethan thought that might work. They spent days planning how they would confront Marie, going over every detail. Their desperation made them ignore the risks and the wrongness of what they were thinking about doing. As they planned, Claire remembered something from her childhood. Once, when she was little, Marie had given in to her demands after Claire had thrown a big tantrum in a store. Maybe, Claire thought, if they pushed hard enough, Marie would give in again. This memory gave her a false sense of confidence in their plan. Ethan, too, was driven by more than just the need for money. Growing up, he had always felt like his family looked down on him for not being successful. Now, at 35, he was still struggling. The thought of getting Marie's money filled him with hope. He could finally prove to everyone that he wasn't a failure. The couple's planning sessions grew longer and more intense. They talked about what they would say to Marie, how they would stand, even what they would wear. They were so focused on getting the money that they didn't realize how their plan was changing them. With each day, they became more willing to cross lines they never thought they would. One evening, as they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, Claire looked at Ethan with a strange light in her eyes. "We're doing this for us," she said, reaching for his hand. "For our future." Ethan nodded, squeezing her fingers. They both felt a mix of excitement and fear about what they were planning to do. The night of May 12, 2024, started like any other. But for Marie Fields, it would be her last. As darkness fell over the quiet streets of Oakville, Illinois, Claire and Ethan made a decision that would change their lives forever. They drove to Marie's house, their car the only movement in the still neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows as they pulled up to the curb. Claire's heart raced as she stepped out of the car. She looked at Ethan, who nodded grimly. They both knew what they had come to do. Marie was surprised when she heard the knock on her door so late at night. She opened it to find Claire and Ethan standing there, their faces tense. "What are you doing here?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. At first, they tried to talk calmly. Claire pleaded with her mother one last time to change her will. "Mom, please. We need this money. Can't you see how much we're struggling?" But Marie stood firm. She shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, Claire. My decision is final. The money is for your children's future." Those words sparked something in Claire. All the years of feeling second best, all the times her mother had refused to help, came rushing back. Her voice rose, filled with anger and hurt. "You've never cared about us. It's always been about you and your precious money." The argument grew louder. Marie tried to calm her daughter down, but Claire wouldn't listen. She paced back and forth, her words becoming more heated with each passing minute. Ethan stood by, his fists clenched at his sides. Suddenly, everything changed. In a moment of blind rage, Ethan grabbed a nearby lamp. Before anyone could react, he swung it at Marie. The sound of the impact echoed through the small house. Marie crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Claire screamed, the reality of what just happened hitting her like a punch to the gut. She looked at her mother lying motionless on the floor, then at Ethan, who stood there with the broken lamp in his hand. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Panic set in. They had come to confront Marie, to convince her to give them the money. But now, in one terrible moment, everything had spiraled out of control. They never meant for this to happen. Or did they? The line between their desperate plan and this violent act seemed to blur in their minds. Ethan snapped into action first. "We need to make this look like a robbery," he said, his voice low and urgent. They started moving around the house, knocking things over and pulling out drawers. But their efforts were clumsy, driven by fear rather than any real plan. As they worked, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. Claire looked at her mother's body and felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was the woman who had raised her, who had worked so hard all her life. And now, because of their greed and anger, she was gone. The sound of a car passing by made them freeze. They realized they needed to leave quickly. As they rushed out of the house, Claire took one last look at her mother. In that moment, she understood the true cost of their actions. They had killed Marie for money they thought they deserved, but now they would lose everything, their freedom, their future, and any chance at the life they had dreamed of. They drove away into the night, leaving behind a scene of violence and betrayal. The quiet neighborhood had no idea of the tragedy that had just unfolded within its midst. As Claire and Ethan sped away, they didn't know that their actions that night would soon come to light, bringing shocking consequences not just for them, but for everyone who knew Marie Fields. Detective Linda Harper arrived at Marie Fields' house early the next morning. As soon as she stepped inside, she knew something wasn't right. The living room looked messy, with drawers pulled out and papers scattered on the floor. But Harper noticed that valuable items like the TV and computer were still there. This made her wonder if it was really a robbery. Harper walked through the house, taking careful notes. In the kitchen, she found a broken lamp on the floor near Marie's body. The detective bent down to examine it closely. She noticed tiny drops of blood on the lamp base. This could be an important clue, she thought. Outside, Harper talked to the neighbors. One of them mentioned seeing a car parked on the street late at night. It wasn't a car they recognized. Harper wrote this down in her notebook. Every detail could be important in solving this case. Later that day, Harper interviewed Claire and Ethan. She watched them closely as they answered her questions. Claire seemed nervous, her hands shaking as she spoke. Ethan kept looking at the floor, avoiding eye contact. Their stories about where they were last night didn't match up. This made Harper even more suspicious. The detective decided to dig deeper into the family's background. She learned about the arguments Marie and Claire had about money. Harper wondered if this could be a motive for murder. She also found out that Ethan had money problems. This information added to her growing list of clues. A few days later, Harper got some important news. A security camera from a nearby house had caught footage of a car that looked like Ethan's. It was parked outside Marie's house on the night of the murder. This was a big break in the case. Harper also discovered something strange. Ethan had tried to sell some jewelry at a pawn shop just days before the murder. The shop owner described pieces that sounded a lot like Marie's jewelry. This seemed very suspicious to the detective. As Harper put all the pieces together, she started to see a clear picture. The messy house that looked like a robbery gone wrong. The family fights about money. The security camera footage. It all pointed to Claire and Ethan being involved in Marie's death. Harper prepared to confront Claire and Ethan with what she had found. She knew this would be a difficult conversation, but she was determined to find out the truth about what happened to Marie Fields. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Claire and Ethan's trial began. People from all over Oakville filled the seats, eager to hear the truth about Marie Fields' death. Detective Harper sat near the front, her face serious as she watched the proceedings. The prosecutor stood up, his voice clear and strong. He laid out all the evidence Detective Harper had found. He showed the jury pictures of the broken lamp, the security camera footage of Ethan's car, and the records from the pawn shop. As he spoke, Claire looked down at her hands, her face pale and drawn. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but his words didn't seem to convince anyone. The jury listened carefully, their faces showing disbelief at times. It was clear they were struggling to understand how a daughter could do this to her own mother. On the third day of the trial, Claire took the stand. Her voice shook as she started to speak. At first, she tried to stick to the story she and Ethan had made up. But as the prosecutor asked more questions, Claire began to break down. Tears rolled down her face as she finally admitted the truth. "We just wanted to talk to her about the money," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean for it to happen like this." The courtroom fell silent as Claire described that terrible night. She told them about the argument, how things got out of control, and how Ethan had grabbed the lamp. As she spoke, many people in the courtroom cried. They couldn't believe how greed had torn this family apart. Ethan's turn on the stand came next. Unlike Claire, he showed no remorse. He tried to blame everything on Claire, saying it was all her idea. But the jury didn't seem to believe him. They saw through his lies and his attempts to save himself. Some of Marie's friends came to testify too. They talked about what a kind and generous person Marie had been. One friend, Sarah, told the court how Marie had helped her through a tough time. "She gave me money for rent when I lost my job," Sarah said, wiping away tears. She never asked for anything in return. As the trial went on, the true tragedy of what happened became clear. Marie had worked hard all her life to save money for her grandchildren's future. But Claire and Ethan's greed had destroyed everything. Now, instead of using that money for college or their first homes, Marie's grandchildren would grow up without their grandmother. After 3 days of testimony, the jury went to make their decision. They didn't take long. When they came back, the foreman stood up, his face serious. "We find the defendants, Claire Peterson and Ethan Peterson, guilty of first-degree murder," he announced. Claire broke down sobbing when she heard the verdict. Ethan just stared straight ahead, his face blank. The judge sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they were led away in handcuffs, the reality of what they had done seemed to finally hit them. Outside the courthouse, Detective Harper talked to reporters. "This case shows how destructive greed can be," she said. "No amount of money is worth destroying a family over." The people of Oakville were left to deal with the aftermath of this tragedy. They mourned for Marie, a woman who had worked hard and tried to do right by her family. And they wondered how they could make sure nothing like this ever happened in their town again. Marie Fields' tragic story left a deep impact on the small town of Oakville. Her death showed how greed could tear a family apart in the worst way possible. The community mourned the loss of a kind woman who had worked hard all her life to give her grandchildren a better future. Marie's grandchildren would grow up knowing their grandmother wanted to help them, but they would never get to thank her. This made the tragedy even sadder. The town learned a painful lesson about the dangers of feeling entitled to other people's money and the importance of family bonds. Experts say that talking openly about money in families can prevent conflicts like this. They suggest making clear plans for inheritance and discussing them with family members. This can help avoid misunderstandings and keep families together. As Oakville tried to heal, people thought about their own families. They realized how important it was to value relationships more than money. The story of Marie Fields would stay with them for a long time, reminding them to be grateful for what they had.